Well, greetings everyone. PMP 6 exam prep step by step, and this is our third day of this course. The session today that we'll be covering is the environment. Now, before we move into the topic, let me give you an example. Now, let's say I want to sell my house, and I have plans. After selling my house, I am going to buy another house in another place. So I have done all this calculation. Calculation is perfect. But then when I get in there, I find that there are a lot of things that is not within my control. Maybe the market is not behaving as I expected. So you see, there are things that is outside our control. And when I go in there, I can either go in just the way in what I feel like, or I can use some existing data. Maybe I can ask a friend information about who to contact and who is the best person who can facilitate this selling of my house. So there are two things here. One is there are things that is outside your control, and there are some information assets that we can make use of. Similarly, when we get into a project, we find that projects are not done in isolation. When you are in organization and you are executing a project, you will find that there are many external factors that influence that. As well as there are things that you can use in the organization. There are things in the organization that you can use that have been stored and can be archived and is available to you based on what happened to projects before you. So these are what we call the project influences. So like we talked about just now, environments, it really reflects the environment in which projects operate. Our project is operating and we are influenced, there are influence from outside our project. And that is what we need to consider, we'll be discussing at this point of time. Now, these influences can have favorable or unfavorable impact. It's not necessarily necessary that all these impacts will be unfavorable or favorable. Just in the case of the example that I gave, in terms of selling my house, the market might be favorable to me or market might be unfavorable to me. But it will influence our project. Now let's look at what are the different influences. The influences, there are two types of influences we talk about. One is what we say enterprise environmental factors. Now, enterprise environment factors, we will refer to these as EEF as we go on. They are really external and we don't have any control. Whereas the other type of influence is what we call the organizational process assets. So remember this term, assets, because they are assets that we can make use of or we might have to abide by. We'll see different types of organizational process assets. Now, when we talk about enterprise environment factors, there are two types. One is external factors and there are internal factors. External factors are typically outside the organization. Factors outside the organization that is influencing our project, and internal factors are factors within the organization that is impacting your project. In terms of assets, organizational process assets, we have two types. One category is processes, policies, procedures that have been laid down in the organization over time, and that our project has to abide by. If you don't, then there can be issues, there can be repercussions, and this set of asset is not something we can change as we go into the projects as we are executing the project. Another category of assets are what we say corporate knowledge base. Now, this corporate knowledge base are different information that will be stored by different projects. So, for example, projects that has come before us would have stored their project plan, their project charter, and their schedule, and these are information that we can actually use in our project. Similarly, when we execute the project, we will add to this corporate knowledge base things like what was our estimation and what was the variation from the estimation. And when we store those information, projects that come after us will be able to use this information in running their project. So to sum up, we see that there are two types of environmental influences. One is enterprise environmental factors, and one is organizational process assets. Now, organizational process assets is internal to the organization. And a third category that influences your project is the organizational system. And we'll look at it in more details. That really refers to what is the hierarchy or what is the relationship, how things work within an organization, what is the structure, organizational structure, and so on and so forth. So these are different things that really work together to influence your project. And as a project manager, I need to be aware of these influences as I move through the project. In fact, when we go through each of the knowledge areas and we look at different processes, we'll find that these factors, environment factors and organizational process assets will come in again and again as input to many of these processes. So let's first look at enterprise and environmental factors, or EEF. Now, EEF, they, as we have said, they're not under the control of the project team. We have no control over them, and typically we need to be aware so that we can react accordingly, we can take into consideration in a way that is helpful for our project. And they can be external or internal to the organization. They are, of course, external to the project, but they can be external to the organization or they can be internal to the organization. External, and most of them probably will be external to the organization the way they come and influence. As we have discussed, it will be, or EEF will be input to many project management processes. As we move through knowledge area to knowledge area, after the next module that we discuss, we'll find out, or we'll talk about what are the inputs that comes into that process, and we'll see that most of, or many of the processes will have enterprise environmental factors as one of the input. So when we're talking about project influences, we talked about the enterprise environment factors, and we said there is external and internal. So let's look at them. Let's look at first internal environmental factors. Those enterprise environmental factors that are internal to the organization, that comes from within the organization and influences or impacts our project. One is organizational culture, structure, governance. So as you can see, different organizations will have different structure. They'll have different culture. And the framework by which the projects are governed will be different. So the culture, structure, and governance within the organization, the way it is, will be one of the environmental factors that we need to take into consideration. Then geographical distribution of resources. In some companies, what we will find, everything is located in the same place, probably in the same office. In another company, or in another organization, we'll find that all the resources, even the offices, facilities, they might be spread out across the world. Today, in fact, you'll find maybe the data center is in one country, the users are in another country, and so on and so forth. So this again is one enterprise environmental factors, the way resources are distributed, and it will impact the way we manage our project. Then infrastructure. There are different kinds of infrastructure, hardware, software, facilities that will also have an impact on our project. Information and technology software, IT software. For example, scheduling. In some organization, you will go, the software that is used for scheduling might be Microsoft project. In another, it might not be Microsoft project, something else, Basecamp or whatever. And then you will have other version control software, configuration management software, collaboration software. They will be different from different in different organizations. We have resource availability, how the resources are available. In some companies, what we will find is resources, maybe all resources are available within the company. In some, you might not have all the resources available in the company, within the company or within the organization, and you might have to procure from outside. Or in some companies, you might have specialized resources. In some, there might not be. So that is again a factor that needs to be considered when we are running a project. And as you can see that all these are really environmental factors that is internal to the organization, and that is going to influence our project. Then we have the employee capability. In some organization, you will find that employees are capable in terms of they have different skills and so on. In some, you might again get it from outside. So these are some internal environmental factors internal to the organization. Then let's see what are some of the external and enterprise environmental factors external to the organization. Marketplace condition. Now, when you say marketplace condition, that means the competitors will have an impact. Competitors and the branding, the trademark, those things can impact our project. Then we have social and cultural influences and issues. So different cultural influence depending on where you are, and if you are in one country, this social and cultural influence might be different from where if you are in another country. And that is also, that needs to be taken into consideration as we run the project, because that will have direct influence in our project. Legal restrictions. There will be local laws, there will be then country laws that we need to take into consideration. For example, if you are into a construction project, you will have to understand what are the laws, different kinds of laws in terms of the building in when you are building or doing a construction. You have to abide by that code. You don't want to land up in a scenario where you have the whole construction done, and then when the inspector comes in, the inspector from the government comes in, and they say you have not taken into consideration the different codes, building codes, and something has to be redone. You don't want to land up in a situation like that. So legal restrictions is something that we need to consider, and these are again some external environmental factors. Then commercial database. Now there are databases, commercial databases today, and many of them, many, that we can take into consideration, that we can use, and that can give us information. And for example, if you are procuring, if you are trying to select a vendor, there will be a database, commercial database that you can subscribe to, which will tell you which vendors are rated, how, what is their track record, and so on and so forth. Or you might want to benchmark some information that you use. Or in fact, you can use many of these, for example, if you're hiring, what is the market rate for a particular skill? So there are different commercial databases that can be, that are external to the organization, of course, and can be used in the organization, in the project. Many times, academic research might also have an influence in your project. For example, I still remember that in one of the projects that I was doing, and it was about the financial risk. And as we are going through the project, we were also keeping up with research that was done in the field of financial risks. And we were taking into consideration many of those research from publications in our project, so that when it comes out, it should not be lagging behind the other competitors who are using this kind of financial risk software. So academic research can also have an impact in your project. Government and industry standards, there are always some standards that you need to abide by. Depending on the industry, the standards will vary. There might be health standards, there might be safety standards. These are things that we need to take into consideration in our project. Financial consideration. Again, financial consideration, things like interest rate, things like inflation, they may impact your project. For example, if you are procuring or you have hired consultant from a different country and you are paying them in their local currency, then how the exchange rate fluctuate will impact your project cost. Or if you have taken funding, or if you are taking funding, what is the interest rate that will impact your project budget? So financial consideration is another external factors or environmental factors that might impact your project. Physical environment, they are really those things like where you are, what is the working condition, What is the safety requirement that is required? What is the weather condition? So these are things, again, can impact our project. So what we have done now, we have looked at in things or external environmental factors that influence our project, and we saw factors that are external to the organization and factors that are internal to the organization. Then, now let's move on to the organizational process assets, or OPA as we call them. Now, as you can see here, there are two categories of organizational process assets. And again, what we talked about earlier, one is the processes, policies, and procedures. And the other category is corporate knowledge base. Again, I'll repeat, processes, policies, and procedures are not something that a project team can update. Whereas a corporate knowledge base is something that a project team will update as they go through the project for the benefit of future projects. So organizational process assets, they are internal to the organization. Unlike what we saw, they are unlike what we saw in enterprise environmental factors, organizational process assets are internal to the organization. It will also include lessons learned. Like we said, what previous projects have put in over there. Let's say a previous project, they'll put in what was their estimate and what was the actual in terms of the cost. What was the variance and where the cost has gone in. They might also provide an analysis, what has happened there because of which there was this variance. Now, when I get in, if I look at a project and get information like that and see those information in terms of estimation and actual, I can see and analyze what has made that variance in the previous project. Does this apply to me? Are those factors applicable to my project? And I can take a call, and if I see that they are, then what I might do in my estimation, I might take those factors into consideration. So my estimation is much more robust. So lessons learned in the organization can also be or will be a part of the OPA. And as we have mentioned, it is about all the projects putting the information, putting in what have they learned, what have their experience, and so future projects can benefit from them. Similarly, our project, as we run through the project, as we execute the project, we will be inputting into these organization processes so that projects that come after us can benefit from our experience and our learning. Now, there are two categories we talked about. One is the process, policies, and procedures. Now, process, policies, and procedures, what we talked about is, has been developed in the organization over time. And that project, the organization has to abide by or is expected to abide by. Now, we look at these processes, policies, and procedures that can impact us in our project in different phases. For example, when we're doing initiating and planning, or when we are executing, or when we are closing, what are those process, policies, and procedures we should look for that might impact our project or that might be helpful to our projects? Now remember this, when we're talking about initiating and planning, and we are talking about executing, and we are talking about closing, we're not talking about the process groups that we'll be discussing. We're talking about the phases of the project, the stages of the project as the project moves from one phase to another phase. Now let's look at first into the initiating and planning phase. What are the processes, policies, and procedures that will be worth looking at? One is guidelines and criteria for tailoring. What does this mean? Now, what we'll find is when we get into an organization, we'll find that there are many guidelines. Now, when you look at PMP, you will find there are some 49 processes. And you don't really need to do everything. We might tailor that to our project and based on what is the guideline that exists in the organization. Or there might be how we are doing the planning. There might be a guideline on how you want to plan, and there might be some, and typically what happens in organization, there are standards that is set. Standards, how you will be reporting, or how you will put together your plan, and so on and so forth. And there will also be criteria for how you can tailor what are the exceptions that can be applied based on project to project. So these guidelines and criteria for tailoring you can use that will be available in these policies, procedures, and processes, and you can apply it to your project. Then some organization standards. For example, there might be HR policies. HR policies, what or how, if you need to hire someone, how will you go about hiring? Do you go through the HR, or can you just go ahead and hire someone and then talk to HR? Each organization will have different way of dealing with it. Or for example, if you are procuring, you want to procure someone, do you have to go through some authorized personnel in the finance before you can go and procure? Or is it someone in the business who will actually give you the approval to go ahead, or can you directly go in and do the procurement? Do you have that authority? So these are different organization standards that will be there. And even when you, let's say you have to sign for contracts and things like that. Then life cycles, methods, what has been used in the organization, what is acceptable in the organization. For example, you might go in an organization and you want to use a life cycle, and you might find that, hey, predictive life cycle, if you want to use, that's not acceptable, and because they have moved the whole organization and moved to the agile methodology. And then templates. Templates are very useful things. Basically, what it helps you in the project is to get the ground running. Basically, if you are starting a project and you have to draw a plan, let's say you have to draw a project plan. You don't want to think through all the what kind of format, what you need to consider in the plan, and so on and so forth. You can do that, but it will take time and you might be missing things out. And what is the point? This has been done before. So an organization is likely to have a template on that. So you take the template and use that in your planning process. And not only it will help you to adhere to the standard in the organization, but also it will make sure that you are not missing something, because this template has been developed over time. Then in many organizations that there might be pre-approved supplier list or contracts. So let's say you want to get some supply or you want to have a contract, you can go only from that approved list. You cannot go to someone outside that list. And if you really want to go to someone outside the list, you might have to go through different processes altogether. And so this pre-approved supplier list will help you, or jumpstart when you really want to get a supplier to provide you something in your project. Then when we look at the executing, monitoring, and controlling phase, there are again some processes, policies, and procedures that is worth looking at. One is, of course, procedures, change control. Now, when we are running a project, or we execute a project, changes will be there. And there will be set down processes that you need to follow through if the change comes. Because when a change comes, you have to ensure that everything is in sync in terms of all the other requirements, in terms of the cost, in terms of time. You cannot just go and make changes. And we'll look at it in much more details in one of the process in the integration management knowledge area. Then resource availability control. So how are the availability of resource control? Let's say you want someone or some resources. So what are the procedures that you will have to go through to get the resources? There will be some control in terms of that. Or maybe you have found there is a valuable resource in another area who is getting released and will be very useful to your project. Now, how you go by to acquire that resource? So there are controls on how you have, how you get your resources. Then issue and defect management, how it is managed, issues and defects that comes, how they are tracked, and so on and so forth. There will be some set down processes. And traceability metrics. Traceability metrics is again something we'll discuss in much more details. But traceability metrics is really a table of requirements. And through these metrics, what you will ensure is these requirements has been addressed at every stage, every phase of the project. You will ensure that these requirements that you have identified has been taken care of in the design, has been taken care of in actual building or executing, has been taken care of in testing, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the project, you can be rest assured that all the requirements have been taken in and nothing got missed out. Standard guidelines, there will be again some standard guidelines. Organization communication requirements. Now, it can be technology, what kind of technology that you use, or it can be about security, how you ensure that you are communicating the information to the right person. Or if you are sending out a communication, do you need to take approval from someone before you send out some information? Because in organization, there are always some confidential information, and what you'll find is project managers are privy to that information. And there might be some kind of control and guidelines how you can disseminate those kind of information. Then verification process. Once it is done, how you should go through verification and validation and so on. So these are some policies and procedures that comes in or will come in play during executing, monitoring, and controlling. And then finally, when we move into closing the project, we'll find that there are different guidelines. There might be a final audit that needs to be taken after the project is completed, or there might be some procedure how you close contract with different vendors that you have, and so on and so forth. So there will be different guidelines when you are closing. So these organization processes, what we're talking about, process, policies, and procedures, we need to take into consideration And this will not only help us adhere to the organizational policy, but also it will help us jumpstart the project. Otherwise, we might be reinventing many things that was already done and we could have just taken out from the organization process asset. We might have just reused from the organization process asset. The next category is what is corporate knowledge base. Now, corporate knowledge base is really an organizational knowledge repository where all the different projects or different sources of information will be put in, and different projects can use that information moving forward. In fact, there will be one process how you manage the knowledge in one of the knowledge area. So let's look at what are things that comes in. Configuration management. For example, different versions of software, hardware, or standards, policies that will be there in the configuration management database. There are softwares, and you might already have used different version control software that helps you to manage the configuration. Then the financial data. There might be financial data in the corporate knowledge base. For example, what is the daily rate? Or what is the hourly rate? Or, if you're funding, what should be the interest rate that should be applied, expected to apply? And so different financial data will be available that you can readily use as you go through the project. Then historical information. Again, historical information is the experiences, learning from previous projects that you can use and really jumpstart your project. Issues and defect management, how issues and defect are managed in terms of how, not only how they're managed, but also in terms of what has happened in the previous, what kind of errors and how quickly errors were resolved, and so on and so forth. Previous project files, like we said, you might just look at what was the project plan for a previous project, or what was the project charter, and or even the stakeholders. Well, who are the stakeholders? For example, if I am going into trying to find out who are my stakeholders in my project, one good way to look at it is a similar project in the past. What were the stakeholders for that project? So that will really give me a jump start, and it will help us ensure that we are not missing on some of the stakeholders. And then many measurements data that can also come into the corporate knowledge base. So corporate knowledge base, as we have said before, is really a knowledge base, and that can be or should be updated by the project team as well, because it is about paying it forward in one sense. And then we have the third thing that we looked at, which influences our project, is the organizational systems. The organizational systems is the interaction of various components, functions to produce results. So let me explain that. Now, when we talk about a system, we really see many different pieces coming together to make that system run. Let's take an example of a car. When we drive a car, there are many different components that come together to take the car forward. There will be pistons, there will be wheels, there will be steering, there will be all sorts of things that come together and help us drive that car. in an organization, if you really look at it, similarly, there are different parts in the organization. There will be a production, and there will be finance, there will be HR, or all these different parts. I'm not talking group, part, different functions, sub functions, all these different components of the system actually come together to drive that organization forward. And there is always an interaction between these different components or different functions in that organization. And this is what the organization system is made up of. And the way it develops into an organization system, it typically evolves over time. Now, if you have worked in different organizations, you will see how different each organization is from another. Every organization is in a way unique because it has developed, and many different factors were taken into consideration when it developed into that organizational system. Some might be because it is big, it has to ensure that all the different sub-organizations in different parts of the world is working together. Or in another, what might have been important is the agility of the organization. And so it develops over time, and at the same time as it develops, many different factors are taken into consideration. So now, what does this mean to a project manager? As a project manager, when you understand the organizational system, how does it help me in running my project? It helps me to understand the power within the organization. Power within the organization in terms of who has what kind of authority and so on, who has what kind of influence, if you may, and the competence within the organization, the leadership. Where is the leadership? And in an organization, you will a lot of times realize that there is a formal leadership, and also there are informal leadership. And so if you are able to understand all these factors, you will be able to navigate your project much better. And of course, the political capabilities, of the power struggle within the organization. So these are things that will help me as a project manager to understand, and will help. And when I understand these things within the organization, it will help me to drive the project, to navigate the project, to help in achieving the objective that we have for the project. Now, organizational system is made up of three elements. Organization systems are made up of. One is what is called governance framework. Governance framework is that framework that helps govern the organization. And we'll look at that in more details. Then management elements, and then finally the organization structure. So let's look at each of them and see how they make up the organizational system. Governance framework. This framework, or the governance framework, it is a structure which tells who can do what, who will be able to approve what, who has the authority, and so on and so forth. So this is a framework that has been developed over time, and typically it includes rules. There will be different kind of rules. For example, if you want to approve an expense over 50,000, then you have to go at that level. Or if it is below that 50,000 mark, then someone else can actually approve that. So there will be different kind of rules. There can be different policies. If you are trying to get a project new project, what are the policies that you should adhere to? Or procedures, policies, procedures we talked about. Norms. Norms develop, the different cultural norms can develop in an organization. For example, in one organization, if you go, you might find that there are occasional business lunches that takes place. So all the different groups come together for those lunches. So the norm has been developed, and probably because they found it is helpful that different people interact informally, somewhat informally, over the lunch. Then relationships develop as you move through, and you'll find that different kinds of relationship exist within the organization, and that is also part of the organization framework, then systems and processes. So all this put together actually creates that organizational the governance framework. Now, this governance framework, it has an influence in terms of organizational objectives, where organization is going, the kind of risk, how it is going to be monitored. For example, if it's a high value project, probably risk will be monitored much more closely. And if it is not a high value project, it's a very simple project, risk might not be monitored so closely. This governance framework will also impact or influence the performance in terms of how the performance, and you can even look at that and see, how this performance can be optimized. So this is a governance framework which is really a structure, how authorities are exercised, how people interact, and it has its different implication when you run a project. Management elements, the second leg of the second leg of the organization system that we looked at, will comprise of things like it will comprise of things like division of work. So how work is divided? Is it divided according to the specialty people have, and so on and so forth? And then what kind of authority is given to perform work? For example, you are a project manager. Are you able to go and recruit people in your project? Or do you have to go through the sponsor or the functional manager to get that? Or to the HR? How much authority do you have? If you want to buy a new computer, can you just go and buy a new computer? Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. Depends on the management element factor in this organizational system. How is responsibility assigned on skills, and what is the unit of command and direction? Do one person everyone reports to one person? Is there a clear direction in terms of what is the objective, and is there a clear plan in where the direction is, what is the direction of the organization? So these are some of the management elements, and how you optimally use of resource, clear communication channels. So these are some of the management elements that come in play when we are talking about organizational system. For example, safety. What are the safety consideration or safety procedures that are in place, especially for projects where safety is an important thing to be considered? For example, a lot of times if you are doing some construction work, there will be very clear laid down safety procedures. And so these are not only, there are many others management elements that actually come together to make the organizational system. Then the final one is the organizational structure. If you really go into an organization you will find that different organizations have developed different kind of structure, the way people interact, the way people report, and so on. So let's look at different types of organizational structure that you might come into when you start a project. One is, or probably the most basic and most well-known, is what is known as a functional organization. The functional organizations are really organization that is grouped by some function. For example, here is grouped by function with one clear superior. So as you can see here, there is a production group, there is a marketing group, there is a finance group, there is an IT group, and all of this is headed by a director of production, director of marketing, finance, director of IT, and all of them report to the CEO of the organization. So that is a typical function organization. Sometimes they call these groups line of business, LOB, or they can call in different names, but this is really a functional organization, and there is a centralized control with the CEO. CEO, through all these groups, can directly see through what is happening. Having said that, each of these functions will do their work independently. So production will do their work, and marketing will do their work, and they are independent in them. And if there is a project that's going to be done, it will be done at the functional level. For example, there might be a project that is required in the marketing. So marketing, it will be driven by the director of marketing, and it will be done within the marketing. Now, as opposed to what we have seen, the functional organization, there can also be multidivisional. Now, multidivisional structure is very similar to the functional, except that this group that you see and that was the function, it can be anything else. For example, like we said, is similar to function, but these groups, that question marks that you see, this grouping can be by product, can be by geography. For example, and this is true typically for large organizations. Let's say there's a very large organization, and so they might have one by geography. For example, one North America group, one South America group, one maybe Europe group, one is Asia Pacific group, one is Asia, one is Africa and Middle East group. So they can be grouped based on geography. And if there are products, again, it might be product. And so what typically happens is there many things gets replicated here. For example, in each, if there are things like that, a lot of times you'll find the IT work that is done in the Europe group is also being done in the North America group. So there can be some replicated function across these groups. Then we have something called project-oriented organization. A project-oriented organization typically is an organization that drives on projects. Now, the hierarchy, everything is defined by the project. For example, if you have a company and the whole purpose of the company is to build hotel buildings. So they get a project team is formed and led by a project manager, and it addresses that particular construction project. Again, another project comes up, and a project team is formed, led by a project manager, and does that particular new construction project, new hotel. So this is a case where the whole organization is run by means of different projects. So it's a project-oriented organization. And what you will see here typically is project manager has a high deal of independence and authority as compared to functional, for example, where the authority is primarily with the functional manager. We saw director of marketing might be calling all the shots. Here, project manager will be calling all the shots because the whole organization is structured around projects, as we see here. Now, in this particular case, especially in project-based organization, for each of the project, it is highly likely that all the team members in a project are co-located, meaning in the same place, but it is not necessarily so, not all the time, especially today with all the technology that is available to run a project with virtual teams. And then we have matrix organization. A matrix organization is really about having similar skills that are pulled together. And what will happen is there will be possibly multiple reporting lines. For example, the staff here that we see in the black box is having a reporting line to project manager B as well as the VP marketing. So because this particular staff is in the marketing group and is doing a project led by the project manager B. And probably this project takes into consideration all things across different groups and led by project manager P. And so this staff will be reporting to VP marketing here because this person belongs to that particular marketing group, and will also report to project manager B because this person is part of that particular project. Now, in this particular case, what really happens is there is an advantage in terms of it is flexible, it's efficient, because once this is done, and a new project starts up, for example, the person can easily be moved around to different projects. Unlike if in a function organization or many other structure, if the person has to be moved, it is not easy to be moved. So because we are dynamically pulling resources in this particular type of organization or matrix organization. Having said that, the communication becomes a little more tricky because there are more communication that is required. Across different lines, you have to keep communication flowing in this particular type of organization. Now, there are three types of this matrix organization. One, what is called the weak matrix, one is called the balanced matrix, and one is called strong matrix. The matrix organization, as you've seen, we can see that in terms of this particular time, spectrum. In fact, at one end, it is a functional organization, and another end, it is projectized. So we saw in the functional organization that the structure is driven by the function. And on the other end, we saw projectized or project-oriented organization, the structure is driven by the project. In the functional organization, we saw that project manager has almost no authority because it is driven by the functional manager. And project-based organization or project-oriented oriented organization, we saw the project manager has a high level of authority because the organization is run as a project. Now, in between this spectrum, we have all these different types of matrix organization. One is called weak matrix, which is really very close to the functional organization. It is matrix, but still the whole authority is with the functional head or functional group head. And here again, though it is a matrix, but then the requirement of the project, it is not run as a project, it's run as something within that function, and all that they look for from in terms of project management is some kind of project coordination. Whereas if you look at a strong matrix, it is very close to project oriented, and there is a considerable authority for PM, for project manager. Like in project oriented organization, the PM or project manager calls the shots. And then if it's balanced matrix, it's somewhere in between. It is not as weak, not like weak matrix where it is more or less a functional organization. It has the characteristic of running projects, that it can run project and recognizes project management. But it is the authority that is given to the project manager is not like the project-oriented organization or the strong matrix, and not much of authority is provided to the project manager here in the balanced matrix. Now, there are some other types of organization structures. One is organic or simple. Now, organic or simple, essentially what you see here is, and typically it happens in a new startup, people come together and work and do as best as they can and move on from there. They are typically very flexible, and there are not a lot of processes. They work side by side, and typically small organization. So this is as they're growing and they are organically developing the structure. There is no you'll typically in this organization you'll find very less of procedures and policies and bureaucracies and all that kind of stuff that is otherwise required for big organization. Then there is a virtual organization structure. The virtual organization structure, what it really means is it will be a network structure. Now, what really it means is for each of the functions or different functions, there will be one person who represents that. And if you have to communicate for anything in that particular function, you will have to go through that particular node person or the person who represents that function. And by virtue of the link between this node or the key personnel within that function, the organization is run. So it is a network structure, or it's called a virtual structure. And then finally hybrid, because this project, this kind of structure can have some part of functional organization and then some of the projectized. So it's kind of mix and match, and that's what is the hybrid. In addition to that, there will be a PMO structure, and which we'll talk about more just now. That's also an organizational structure. Now let's look at different influence in terms of project manager authority and resource ability. If you look at the main structures, in functional there's little to none. In metrics As we go from weak to strong, we find the authority keeps on increasing, and finally for project oriented, it is high to total authority for project manager. Who manages the project budget? That's an important thing to understand. In functional, it is a functional manager. Even in the weak metrics, it is a functional manager. Whereas in strong metrics and project oriented, you'll find project manager is managing the project budget. In case of balanced, it is probably mixed. In some cases, you'll find it is a function manager. Some cases, and you'll find it is a project manager. And many times, they both together will do that. In project manager role is really part-time in functional and weak metrics, and full-time in projectized and strong metrics, and full-time in for the balanced metrics. In terms of admin stuff, you'll find that this part-time in case of the balanced metrics. Now, project management office. I know we have already exceeded the time, but I'll continue a few more minutes to finish this module. I hope it's okay with you. Now, project management office. Now, before we discuss this project management office, let's think about an organization scenario. Let's say an organization is a pretty big organization, and there are many projects running. And there is nothing central, it is not centrally managed. So what will happen is each of these projects run on their own, do whatever needs to be done. Now, when we look at the scenario, you will soon realize there will be a lot of wastage in this kind of scenario. And lot of things that could have been synergized by virtue of a communication between them, by virtue of working together between the projects, is lost. So for example, one project might be using some template, another project might be using some other way to run the project. And in one project, they might use some vendors for the same thing. Another project, they may use another vendor. Now, to take away or avoid this kind of waste and bring more efficiency, the concept of project management office comes in play. The project management office, really what it does, it facilitates sharing of resources, methodology, tools, and techniques across these projects. The project management office is there, and you can go to the project management office and say that, hey, I'm doing this project, these are the resources I need, and what is the methodology for this kind. They will be able to help you out because they have the oversight of all the projects that run in the organization. And they also standardize. Now, when there is a standards form, they ensure that all the projects are following the standard. And that is a good thing in many sense, because once you follow the standard, it is easy for you to communicate with your stakeholders in the organization, as well as you are using something that is time tested, and it is going to be more efficient for your project. Now, there are different types of PMO structures. One of them is what is called directive. Now, in case of directive or PMO structures, what it really means, the PMO will directly manage your project. In fact, the project manager is reporting to the PMO. And they have a very high level of control, high control. As opposed to directive, there is another which is called controlling type of PMO structure. The controlling type of PMO structure or controlling type of PMO will not directly manage your project. Instead, what they'll do is they'll have a set of compliance policies, and they'll occasionally audit to ensure that you're following this, you're complying through those policies. So in effect, though they are not controlling you directly, though they are not directly managing a project, they are keeping a control through compliance by asking you to comply to different standards through audit and so on and so forth. And then there is this supportive type of PMO. Supportive type of PMO, what they'll do is they'll come and tell you, hey, we are there to help you. We are available to train you and your team in terms of the different processes, and we can help you in getting resources. And so they are consultative, they are supportive, but they are not taking any kind of control on how you are running a project. So you see there are three types: directive, controlling, and supportive. And if you really look at the control, how much control these different type of structures have, the highest is the directive, and then you have the controlling type of PMO structures, and the least control is the supportive type of PMO. They have very little control on your project. So different the functions that PMO plays in the project is one is they manage shared resources. If your project need a resource that is also being used by another project, they can coordinate that. Then they will identify and develop best practices. They constantly look at how each projects are doing and what they've gained and what are the best practices, what practices work for them, and they'll include that in the practices that they develop. They'll be available for coaching, mentoring, and oversight you and your team to run the project efficiently. And they'll also do more compliance monitoring, like we said, compliance type of PMO. But all of them will ensure that they are maintaining compliance, and they'll maintain policies and procedures and develop them. And also they are a good resource for communication. For example, you want some information and you can go to them and say, hey, I need this. That particular, some of the other projects are doing that. So they can help you establish communication between the other groups so that you can get help from the others, get some ideas, get some inputs from the other projects. So PMO can be a very useful, is a very useful function, and more useful for bigger organizations than the smaller ones. So with this, we are finished with this particular module, and tomorrow we'll go in for the next module, which is the role of project manager. We are a little over time today. Thank you, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you.